Hi, I'm Cara Sofoko, and this is the over-the-top, under-the-radar budget special. The UK's Chancellor Rachel Reeves has just delivered her 2025 budget, and I am here with economist James Meadway, who hosts the Macrodose podcast, and Hannah Peaker, Deputy Chief Executive at the New Economics Foundation and one of the hosts of the New Economics podcast. We are putting out a special joint budget episode this week. This episode is brought to you with Power to Change to celebrate Community Business Week, which starts on the 29th of November. I feel like we have to start with the leak. Normally, the OBR forecast comes out like after the Chancellor has sat down and given her speech. We actually got it like 5 minutes before the speech came out.
Even more, like an hour, I think, wasn't it?
Which must be like, and then we got the apology from the OBR.
We also had Stride saying it was a criminal act. I mean, there was all sorts going on.
Yeah, then obviously because the MPs are already, and the Speaker are already grumpy that so much has been leaked. And so then for the actual 200-page document about the economy to be leaked when MPs were in the chamber and like it's harder for them to read it. Is it a metaphor?
I mean, also the OBR, as we know, has been under a lot of pressure and facing a lot of criticism. Like, was this their revenge moment?
Or was it just that they are actually under lots of pressure and there's about 5 of them trying to do everything? Yeah. I mean, I mean, it's tragic, but the misspelling and on like some of the graphs and things, corporate instead of corporate and a few other, and it's just like, this could be a plea for more money for the OBR, right? It could be.
I mean,
just give it a bit more cash.
It is a genuine reminder, as our fiscal policy is decided on the basis of tiny movements in the OBR's forecasting, that they are a relatively small team, and in the end, those decisions are taken by 3 men. And so possibly here there is a plea for additional resourcing, which might also improve their control of our fiscal policy.
This has been an unexpected turn towards sympathy. So maybe that was it. Maybe it's just an appeal for sympathy from the OBR. They've had a hard time and they really wanted to demonstrate the good work they do in preparing.
But some poor digital comms officer's head is going to roll. If indeed that's what happened, we don't know. I'm sure we'll find out, and this will be now the fixation for the post-budget analysis of what went wrong.
It is painfully easy to do these things. One slipped finger and one send button, it's there,
also,
but for the grace of God.
Sometimes if you've got a big thing going out, and shout out to anyone else who's managed a website, sometimes you upload the document, but you just don't link to it, because what you don't want is for the document to go down or the upload to fail. So I really have empathy, but presumably someone hit send on something and everyone was directed to the webpage.
I would assume so. There was that brilliant moment, though, on BBC coverage when Faisal sort of paused to say, "I believe I'm delivering the budget now," as he was reading out the key measures before the Chancellor had had a chance to.
I feel like that sort of links to another theme. I know we're going to get into the actual budget and the actual economy, but I do feel like, is this the most leaked budget? Like, have we known the most about it before any others? James, you've been following it for the longest.
Sure. I mean, like, once upon a time, this was all super secret squirrels in the run-up to the budget. That was the whole point. It was like George Osborne pulling out some clever rabbit from a hat. He was going to surprise us all with something, Going back a bit, Hugh Dalton, Labour's Chancellor of the Exchequer, accidentally said a single sentence of the budget to a journalist like the day before and had to resign because of it. This was like back when they took this sort of seriously. Now, and particularly ever since Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget back in 2022, it seems so long somehow, that they dropped this absolute clangor, the market's panicked, and this is the story, and therefore the Treasury's been paranoid about everything ever since. But there's a bit of a case of saying, well, why not just get rid of the pantomime? Like, why not just actually have a process that is, you're going to say, okay, we're going to discuss everything beforehand and then do it, instead of this slightly odd thing on the day where you got the red box and then that's supposed to be the budget, and then you have this nonsensical response. I mean, not criticising Kemi Badenoch, there are plenty of things to criticise her about, but like, if you're the opposition, usually you don't get to see the budget at all, right? So you have to respond straight away to whatever the Chancellor's just said with a tiny little redacted document version of it.
Because, you've been in that position, James, like you've advised Labour when they were in opposition. So you have this, if you're Kemi Badenoch's team or like whoever's on the opposition benches, do you just pre-write a script and then slip some numbers in, like over someone's shoulder? Okay,
yes, literally that's exactly the process. So you just pre-write it, which is why whenever you see the leader of the opposition responding to the budget, it's a load of just nonsense, really. It's just a load of jokes you've got pre-written. And I think that's what we saw this time round. Even with the leak beforehand, it was too late to just put in the entire budget and try and respond to it.
Although this does tie into kind of this broader point of our fiscal framework creating a particular sensitivity to bond market reactions. And so in their defense, or not, they find themselves in a position where they feel like they need to manage the market reaction.
Yes.
And a lot of what they're doing in the weeks before, aside from the internal politics that played out in this particular build-up, is also trying to prepare the market so that you don't get a sudden and significant reaction on the day. And that is a situation which we should try and extricate ourselves from for lots of reasons.
So in terms of the actual forecast and the, because there's two bits, right? There's the what's going on in the economy, and then there's here's all my tax and spending announcements. As a non-economist, felt like the economic forecast was kind of a bit meh. Like, it's not great, but it's not great in the way we thought it wouldn't be great.
It's exactly as bad as they leaked that it would be, essentially. So nothing is worse than anybody would have expected, like some weeks beforehand, on all of this. So that's like growth is down a bit, productivity growth, which is the sort of the big driver of growth over the long term, is also down a bit. Real household disposable income doesn't look too good. Inflation's up slightly. I mean, all of it looks pretty bad, right? I mean, we're saying this, and actually this is a really pretty dismal set of forecasts in the usual sense you might judge these things. But because we've already kind of been told all about it some weeks ago, like the shock has sort of worn off.
So maybe it's a success, Hannah, or no?
No, it's definitely not a success. And of course, I mean, we could predict that story without any massive armory, because that's been the story of the British economy for over a decade now. Just really sluggish growth, if any, a stagnant economy. And that's the context in which she's delivering this budget. So certainly not an easy set of choices that she's facing. She went to kind of great lengths to celebrate the fact that I think growth was going to be up in this year.
1.5%.
Yeah, which just doesn't mean very much for people materially. There's nothing in what's being forecast or in their plans that suggests any real effort to kind of fix the structural problems in our economy. And so for me, like the big story coming off the back of this, which I think actually is getting a little bit less attention, is so much of that tax raise that she's doing is just getting stuck onto headroom. Now, some people will say, well, that's a good thing. It means, it offers some calm in the markets. She doesn't feel that she has to come back again for more. We're not buffeted around by geopolitical events in quite the same way. But actually, if you've got that stagnant economy, very little growth, it's quite dangerous. It's quite risky to pile all of that onto headroom, because you're just taking that money out of the economy. And if you stick it on headroom, it's just deflationary.
Yes. Just so pleased that you raised this, because I really do think that is the big story of the budget. Like, in terms of what was eating up the most money out of the revenue that she raised from taxes, it's all going on this headroom. And just to be clear, headroom it's a kind of engineering term, I suppose, to give economics that kind of spurious veneer of something that works, right? Yeah. Sciencey and engineering. It's the difference between the amount of borrowing that she's allowed to do, the government is allowed to do, given their own rules, and the amount they're actually going to do. And so they have, if they wanted to, their rules say they can borrow about 20 billion, actually it's about 22 billion, isn't it? More than they are doing, right? So they're coming in well under that. It's not quite as big, because George Osborne and other people with similar fiscal rules did the same thing, but they made the headroom even bigger. It's not quite as big as that, but it's a lot bigger than the £9 billion that she had last year. And that £9 billion being really quite small in terms of the whole economy was part of the reason, exactly as you say, Hannah, we've had this sort of issue all year of the economy's been knocked a bit off course. And so it's come dangerous. The government has come dangerously close to breaking its own rules, which is insisted as the most terrible thing that could ever happen. So of course you get this kind of market panic and interest rates going up and all the rest of it. If you give yourself more headroom over the year, this is the thinking, and exactly as you say, hopefully it won't work. But you touch on the most important part here, which is that this is money the government is not spending.
Right.
If the government is not spending and raising taxes, that is the government sucking money out of the economy. That means there's less spending in the economy. That means businesses earn less, people have less money in their pockets. There'll be a drag on employment. There'll be a drag on consumer demand. It means that growth is going to be slower than you would have thought. So it perversely adds to this decline that we've seen and this stagnation that we've seen over the last few years.
So headroom's like wiggle room or buffer.
Yeah.
So, because I mean, that is the headline to the extent we're recording on the same day, right? So the headlines are emerging, but the headline from the Tories, headline from the FT is like £26 billion tax raise. And most of that's going into wiggle room.
Yes.
Like not actual stuff.
That should actually be the story, because
Lord.
I don't particularly have a problem. And actually, and maybe this is going to be a slightly controversial point, but I think she could have gone further and should have gone further on tax raising. And I think that would have also enabled her potentially to do a bit more on the borrowing side. But just stick all of that on headroom, and not in this moment when people are struggling so much, spend that into the economy on the kind of cost of living policies, some of which you did see in this budget, but that could have really in this next 2-year period really changed how people experience the economy. I think is a huge missed opportunity, and perhaps a dereliction of duty. And if you then think onto what's coming, the big challenges that we know are coming around climate crisis, but also around aging population, the thing that no political party or government ever wants to confront, I also don't buy that it gets you out of the position that you're ever going to have to come back for more.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, to the politics of it, it feels like a huge missed opportunity, because this is her second budget. She shouldn't think in terms of electoral cycles, but she should have done the difficult, unpopular things last year and this year, because one, then there's a chance for the impacts to be felt by people. And I feel like, aside from these numbers that we sort of spew out but don't mean much to normal people, like productivity and growth, if you want to change the fundamentals of the economy, you need to do it a few years out from the last election. So she's missed that chance. And then also they're just squandering this massive majority that they had. They can get anything through, basically. And they're choosing to get through all these tiny tinkering, pointless things. So it does feel a bit like, whilst I think she did a good job in the chamber and was relatively confident, quite buoyant, quite punchy, I just think overall people are going to look back and be like, this was when Labour lost the next election, potentially.
I mean, I'll try and do the case for the defence for Labour from this point of view, which is they'd probably say they did do the difficult decisions last year, right? They did do a big increase in national insurance contributions from employers. So if you want to hire someone, you as an employer have to pay a lot more tax than that now. And that raised really quite a lot of money, right? It's a 20 billion odd amounts, which they put into spending, and they borrowed some more money for various bits of investment. And that's all the difficult decisions last year. The problem they've got is that it was all kind of predicated on there being a miraculous return to growth over this year, which hasn't in fact happened and was probably never likely to happen. So here we are coming up to autumn 2025, winter 2025 by this point, having to correct for all that. And Karis, I think you're right. I think there's a good chance. In fact, the OBR give it a 40% chance that the government will miss its own targets, and we'll all be back here next year doing exactly the same thing, scrabbling around for more headroom, more tax rises. And it's awful. This is the doom loop, by the way. But it's a doom loop that the government is contributing to.
Right.
It's exactly...
That's where my empathy runs out.
Yeah.
And no, I'll add to the defence, which is, I know they're not allowed to say it anymore, but the inheritance was appalling.
Yeah.
And so even
she still said it.
Yeah, she still say it. Even, that massive increase in investment, which was absolutely necessary, basically gets you just to a standing start. Yeah. So it doesn't actually improve things, and it doesn't tackle the fact that there's growing demand. So in what world did you not know that you were going to have to do more? And then the point at which I think it's frustrating, and I think Centax have talked about this really well, is in the history of the last 30 years of budgets, all of this build-up, and then effectively what you get is people moving the dial up and down on some fairly straightforward measures that they can do because they're designing things at the last minute. So you kind of knew that they would have had to have done a hell of a lot of design work to do some of the more structural things on the tax side of things. Even with the property tax, which I'm sure we'll come on to, it's slapdash. It's the way that you can do it if you are doing it at the last minute. It doesn't fundamentally redesign the system. Yeah. And if you are serious about tackling these problems long term, you're going to have to do a lot more of that structural work, especially on the wealth side.
Sometimes changing the world starts with changing something in your local area. Power to Change backs the people running community businesses, whether it's a pub, farm, library, or leisure centre. From the 29th of November to the 5th of December, Community Business Week is a national celebration of the businesses that make our local areas vibrant, resilient, and inclusive. If you live in Gateshead, Newcastle, Manchester, Bristol, or Birmingham, there are events you can attend throughout the week. You can find an event or download the toolkit at powertochange.org.uk or search #Community Business Week to find out more.
Should we get on to some of the actual specifics? Because there's a bunch of, there were enough changes in there for it to be this is a story as well. Hannah, you mentioned the property tax changes. Do you want to spell that out, what it looks like?
Yeah, so it looks like they're going to be well, what was trailed really. They're going to be. Hang on, let's just rewind a second and remind ourselves. 1991 was when these rates were set.
This is the council tax rates.
Yeah, that was, I think, Everything I Do It For You was number one at that time. Just to remind everyone what was going on.
90s nostalgia, great times.
It was when we had the first website,
transported,
pre-iPhone,
and these rates were set then. And they haven't changed since. So, of course, it is sensible to say that this is something should change. It's not right that somebody in Blackpool is paying a higher rate of council tax than somebody in Kensington.
Yeah.
But, as I say, they've taken an easy option. So they've taken the top two bands. Is it the top two bands or the top one band? And they are going to say above 2 million, properties above £2 million are going to pay a higher effective rate of council tax. They've staged that. So within that, there'll be different rates for different property values. And that does something, right? But then if you look at the actual revenue it's generating, it's not a huge amount.
Yeah.
And there could have been a lot more. And it also doesn't tackle the fact that, and this is like a very London story, so forgive me, but like if you were in Hackney, those house prices really went up too. And you might be in a lower band than the one that they're applying this change to, and you won't feel any change. So there's it also doesn't completely deal with the fairness argument. And they basically, what it looks like is that they changed it at the last minute to be properties valued over 2 million because of some pressure from their voting groups in London.
Yeah, it's a London thing, because that's the only place where, because basically, council tax is very regressive. It's tied to 1991 property valuations, and property markets changed quite a lot. And probably the biggest, there's going to be a wedge of people in like Lambeth, Hackney, different areas of London that currently vote Labour and might be voting Green at the local elections, where people will have had houses that they bought that weren't that expensive, but just because of the insane inflation in property prices, they're property millionaires. So yeah, I agree. I think that was a good one. Agree, it wasn't ambitious enough.
Yeah, they need to do the revaluation that nobody wants to do wholesale across the board. And that's what I mean. You've got to put in the hard yards to actually do that work, to come up with a tax system that is fair, that is simple, that is, you can tell a clear story to voters and it delivers the kind of revenue that we need.
I mean, they floated this, I mean, along with absolutely everything else, but they floated that they were looking at doing a really comprehensive property tax change, which was going to be based on a paper by the academic Tim Loynick, which was like, we're going to get rid of stamp duty, which, like, particularly if you have to buy a house you hate. And it is a kind of really crap tax in lots of different ways. Get rid of that, merge it with council tax, call it one unified property tax, and it'll be much fairer. And that Blackpool versus Kensington problem disappears and it raises a load of money. And they kind of floated this. But then, of course, it was like, a month away from the budget. You're not going to do a massive overhaul of the entire property tax system a month out from the budget. There's this recurring theme, like you said, of just they're not planning. They didn't seem to plan before the election. They're barely planning once they're in government. And it's just crashing around trying to get the fiscal rules to work,
Sounds like a sort of permanent essay crisis. They're always doing it like night before, just like chugging coffee and Red Bull. And so but there was another thing I liked. So the taxes on, effectively landlords and people with like big investment portfolios, because right now, if you work in Greggs, you will pay more tax than someone who is renting out flat in the next to Hackney Greggs. I live in Hackney. So that was like a smart thing, right? Changing in line with like the farmers stuff, which, just to point out, there were two massive tractors parked in Westminster, lest we forget that farmers do not want to pay inheritance tax. So like that felt like a smart, good thing. Yeah, but again, will it not raise? How much will it raise? Anything?
Well, I can't remember. It's not huge. It's not nothing, right? It's not nothing. It's one of the bigger ones in there, but you're talking a few billion sort of end of it, right? So it's more than the 400 million, but it's not like, this is going to transform taxation. But again, it's like, for sure, these are sort of things that are quite good to do, and it's a bit of something, and it's kind of in the right sort of area. And, to make a slightly political point, this is a government reacting to felt pressure from its left now, I think.
Yeah.
And that is the big change. Like, we can, I'm sure there'll be lots of dissection over the days ahead. And we certainly didn't get the things that we were hoping to see on the structural reforms on the wealth side. But the fact that they even felt they had to do enough to signal fairness, to signal, requiring those with the broader shoulders to pay their fair share, does matter. It matters enormously, and that, is due to lots of campaigning, lots of work behind the scenes. And so, all credit to it. But also, you had that moment where she went off script, right? And she made a very pointed comment at the opposition about them getting more riled up about about
the
tax
child
on
benefit cap,
yeah,
child benefit cap.
yeah,
They were
about the
really heckling and jeering there.
Exactly,
Just the
that compared
idea
to a
of
£5 million.
children getting money. Jeez, especially poor ones.
Yeah, and like that also we do this terrible thing in progressive spaces of forgetting to celebrate wins. Like we've gone straight over it.
Exactly.
Like that
Yeah,
really
no, it
should
was
be
a
the
big one.
story.
Say we should get right onto this one
That
because
should
it
be
is
the story
important.
of this budget.
Yeah.
It's so significant, and lots of people say it shouldn't have been there in the first place, but it was. It was a horrible punitive measure that basically said, if you happen to be born a third child or fourth or fifth, you just are therefore not entitled to any
child
support
benefit.
from the state. And I think it was so awfully designed. I remember being at a conference in Iceland and mentioning this and then talking about the rape clause, which they then had to hurriedly also introduce to account for the fact that not all children might be born out of consent, and therefore required women to prove that they weren't, that they had been raped in order to qualify. I mean, it was just the absolute rock bottom of the austerity era. And I remember in Iceland people saying, well, why aren't you taking to the streets over this? They just couldn't believe that this was being tolerated. And so to see it today lifted, and to know that that's the kind of policy that overnight will mean hundreds of thousands of children are not trapped in such an extent of poverty, and that their life chances just look a little better. We have to give the government praise for that.
I totally agree. I mean, I think it's one of those things where we should say that it is good because it is a good thing to do.
Yeah,
And I think it's also worth saying it's good because we won it. Right, this was not something they wanted to do. This was something they were digging their heels in. There are Labour MPs
lost the whip,
exactly
right?
Lost the whip over saying we shouldn't be doing this. It's, like you say, it's the nadir of austerity. It's one of the worst measures that the previous governments had introduced. It should never have been something that Labour contemplated, and they had to be dragged to get here, and they have to be forced to get here. And it's not good that you have to do that. But it's important that it happened. It's important that we got here, for sure.
And even then, once they'd finally said they were going to do it, they had to, counter it with a little bit of, but we are going to deal with the benefit fraud.
Oh, the
and we are going to push through with the
thing,
welfare reforms. And it's so frustrating as well, because it's such an apples and oranges comparison.
Yep.
You're not talking about the same thing. You're talking about also in a week where the inquiry came through on the carers allowance scandal, where you can see a situation where people have inadvertently paid a penny, earned a penny over the threshold, and that has delivered them thousands of pounds of debt because of effectively a system and compliance problem, not any bad intent. To be going around saying, but we will deal with benefit fraud, which is, by the way, not what's driving up the number of claimants in our benefit system.
No.
It is possibly, in some cases, it will drive up overpayments in the benefit system. But goodness me, to have to do that to justify relieving children from child poverty just feels...
Yeah, I mean, we're also only a few weeks out from the scandal showing that thousands of people had their child benefit cut off because they'd gone on a holiday and the government thought that they had left the country. Like literal parents saying, I went to America for a week and then HMRC cut off my child benefit because they said I'd moved there. I think it also, though, touches on my biggest critique of Rachel Reeves, other than her fiscal rules, which are nonsense. I don't know if we'll have time to talk about them. I just think they're bananas. But I think the other problem is she doesn't have a coherent story she's telling about the economy. So then you just get all of these weird kind of incoherent, like rabbits or whatever animal she pulls out of the hat. Like the thing that stuck with me most is she's still talking about the black hole and the inheritance from the Tories, correctly so. But then she's like, it's huge, it's terrible, it's worse than we thought. But then she's like, but don't worry, I won't make you pay too much tax. And it's like the thing that George Osborne and that sort of Cameronite government had so well was they had a really coherent story about the economy that justified getting rid of all the youth clubs, slashing the state. So it's like, if it's that bad, why are you telling people they won't have to pay much? Yeah. So it just doesn't quite add up. And then, as you say, you get these like, I feel like it's just a budget for lobbyists. And it's like, she was crediting it occasionally, thanks to this group or this MP, just loads of little things that people have petitioned her for that she's given. And then like, what does it add up to?
And one really big thing, I mean, on the lobbying point, in some ways, the most important budget story was one the day before, not something the government had put out, but Financial Times had spoken to a bunch of people in financial services industry who said, yeah, the Treasury have asked us to say nice things about the budget, because they didn't go after the whacking great profits that every single bank has been making for the last few years because interest rates have gone up. I mean, they're literally all-time record profits for banks in this country and across the world, in fairness, bolstered, incidentally, by something that the New Economics Foundation has rightly raised, which is the £20 billion or so we every year give to the Bank of England so it can hand that over to the commercial banks to keep their profits nice and tasty for the year. The Treasury hasn't gone after them because they've been lobbied, and the Treasury has a close relationship to the City of London. That's just how things work. But to see it laid out like that, and the quid pro quo as, hey, we're going to have some nice stories, not like, oh, okay, that means we can do something fundamental about the structural reforms that are needed in this country, which would include not having a financial system that goes running off into the distance, making all-time record profits when most people are seeing their living standard squashed, by the way, but we can get a nice story out of the other side. I mean, I thought it was so telling about the kind of compromises that this government has ended up with.
We are going to see more and more of this, and the other parties will face it too, because you're living in an era where they have split voter bases. So they're this kind of talking to both sides at once makes it feel a very odd story. But when Labour came into the election, it was very clear that they had two groups of hero voters that it basically needed to rally, and it could afford to ignore everyone else. That's not turned out to be true. It could ignore the whole of the left. The thing that united those two groups was economic insecurity. So how you have, like, we're only just getting to the point where cost of living is being narratively kind of positioned front and center of everything. There was a lot of that in there today, but we haven't got to the point where that's your guiding economic strategy, and therefore that you're willing to do the stuff that make the changes. But the central bank losses to not, I cannot, the fact that has, become a relatively mainstream idea with support from,
Can you explain
across
that to
the
people who've never heard of it?
Oh gosh. Well, it's effectively a throwback or a dysfunction created from days of quantitative easing. And effectively, we are paying for the losses that the central bank has on its reserves, unusually doing that as taxpayers. Which in other countries you just don't, you would never say, okay, well, we'll foot the bill for that. And obviously the bank has its own arguments about, well, okay, broadly though, overall, you also got the benefits of this arrangement. But it's just with the fiscal constraints as they exist, even if you take away the self-imposed ones, it's not justifiable to keep saying that taxpayers should foot the bill for this, quirk of a design. And then plus we're, going through a process of quantitative tightening at the same time, which is creating, more of that. So I think I cannot understand, that's not just because I work for the New Economics Foundation, but why this wasn't one of the things that they reached for. It would have been, I think, politically painless compared to some of the other options that
I think
pursued.
it touches on your point, which is that because this government is so obsessed with mainstream media headlines and lobbyists and briefings. And, unfortunately, the poor children of the UK do not have a lobbying arm that they can, there's the Children's Society and things, but they don't have lots of very well-paid lobbyists and PR people that can be briefing to the FT. So it's like they don't want the bad headlines. And that's why I think they consistently, which brings me on to my thing that's not in the budget that I think they should have done, they consistently stop going after the richest people who could solve some of our problems. So I don't know if there's more policies people want to talk about, but the thing I think is missing that, again, I think she's missed the chance to do now is she should have done a windfall tax on people that made a ton of money during COVID. There was something about the COVID fraud, 400 million, Michelle Moan, all the PPE contracts that were just given out to Matt Hancock's friends or people who were nice to Matt Hancock. But I think the thing that a Labour Chancellor could have done in 2024 or 2025 was do a one-off windfall tax on the companies that made out like bandits during the pandemic, many of whom also took furlough money from us. So that was everyone from Amazon to the big banks. And I think I was really sad to see nothing on it in this budget, because I think that there's only so long you can talk about COVID, and everyone already has sort of forgotten it and wants to forget it. And I just feel like that was a big source of cash. If we need billions, that's in the realm of billions. And again, it's sure, who's going to be unhappy? Amazon? Who cares? No one cares if Amazon's unhappy. But I think this government do care about quotes in the FT or the Times or the Telegraph. And I think that's a big mistake long term. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Windfall tax?
Yes, I think some of those things are pursuable, and where we have done it, they've proven popular, they've proven effective. I still would rather see kind of more of the structural changes so that can be sustained long term. I'm trying to think then and connect it into the piece that they've done on levies on energy bills, right? And I don't know all of the details of this, but as I understand it, what has been, so in order to bring down energy bills, they've taken off the levy, which is part what funds the transition and improvements to homes and things. Now, the bit that's actually been scrapped is the ECO, and that was the part that was the obligation on the companies to actually continue to pay for these kinds of measures. And then what it looks like from the OBR's report is that the other part will just be made up for in borrowing, I think. Yes. So in a sense, it's sort of that story of like the taxpayer will continue to play their part, which we do need as well, absolutely. But the company is getting away from playing its part. And that kind of stuff, I think, really starts to irritate people, and rightly so, when they see that kind of inequality of expectation.
Two things on that. I mean, one of them is just the general picture. The OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, spelled out and spelled wrong. It was an unfortunate typo in the graph. But showing, I know, you do feel for them.
Although, spell check. Okay.
I know. I don't know how corporate got through the spell check, but there we are. But it is a graph showing the amount that people pay in taxes on income from labour, from work. So your wages and your salaries, and in total about 40%. And how much you pay on profits, and it's about 15%. And that is an enormous wedge between the two different things. And it's still just money that you get. It's just that one kind of money that you get is paying much less tax. And what you see over and over again is versions of the story you just talked about, where like you're pussyfooting around with various big companies that have lots of money. I mean, how much is sitting in UK corporate bank accounts at this point in time? It's well above £900 billion. They are sitting on huge amounts of cash. These are cash rich, particularly bigger corporations. Smaller businesses, much less so, of course, but bigger corporations, cash rich, and we are doing nothing whatsoever to make them change their behaviour seriously or to go after that money. Likewise, the wealthy. And everybody else gets this steady creep of, for example, threshold freezes on the income tax, which is the other big revenue.
I think that's a really important distinction. And like you both have talked, very clearly about some of these problems are big structural fixes. The thing that stuck in my craw was for a Labour Chancellor to stand up and brag about corporation tax being the lowest in the G7. It's a tax we can collect. It's a tax we know can be paid. We get a lot of criticism of, we don't know how we'd do a wealth tax. All the rich people would leave. It's like, don't stand up and brag that corporations with like fewer obligations than ever, paying barely any tax. That felt like an obvious one to bring up.
Don't sell us so short that the only way that you can possibly attract investment into this country is in a race to the bottom. And don't also pretend that businesses don't rely on a functioning public society with public services that work so that their workers can access healthcare and live in affordable homes and have roads that work for their deliveries and whatever else. Like we all rely on that. And I do think they haven't got to the place. And I wonder that it's now going to get worse as they move into kind of cost of living type measures that are bills focused, of they underselling the fact that what that was paying for, by the way, was something that in the end for the poorest households, I think Neff's going to have some numbers coming out on this later today, but it's going to mean potentially that you're going to be, for the poorest households, are going to be colder and with higher bills for longer. Taking with one hand and giving with the other. I do find that really difficult, but they are going to have to reconcile it because we're moving into a period now where they are going to have to set up kind of here as we approach an election, and with you struggling so much, are some of the things we're going to do that will impact you now and help you now, but also how does this stitch together with a longer term story about change?
I think the thing that stuck out most to me was, with this budget, just how outdated the current model is. Yeah. Rachel Reeves stood up, Kemi stood up, and none of the cameras in the chamber and none of the media are trained on Millbank Tower, where, as we are recording this, Nigel Farage will be making a TikTok video that 1.4 million people will see. GB News will have him on and boost that as well. And like, she's delivering a budget just talking about Labour and the Tories, attacking the Tories, when really the real threat, the threat from the left is the Green Party. We've got a little barb at Zach, and we got a little barb at Farage being a Russian asset or something. But like, most people won't watch the budget. Most people won't watch the response. But the people that Labour need to worry about, the people who are going to go out and vote reform. And I think this is just like a more of the same budget for the establishment, the elites. And I feel like politically, it was a real missed opportunity. And it just feels like Labour is stuck in like a world of 10, 15 years ago where they only need to worry about the Tories and good FT headlines. Don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel a bit conflicted on that. Like, I actually worry that they are overly obsessed with a small proportion of potential reform voters at the expense of everything else. And like this, a particular feature of this government is like an absolute obsession with polling, and they haven't shifted out of that since kind of the election point of their strategy into the governing point. And that can create all kinds of distortions. There's just this Workington man, this guy from the north who may leave you for reform. So much of our policy and discourse has become focused on his needs and expectations at the expense of other people's. So, yeah, I agree that there's definitely still a very antiquated process to all of this that doesn't reach most people. It was funny when the OBR stuff came out ahead of the actual budget that people were like, well, now no one's going to watch the actual delivery of that's your final audience. The kind of like policy wonks aren't even going to tune in for this. So that does need to be dealt with, but that's a kind of broader thing about kind of modernizing the House of Commons, making it accessible to people. It's a separate thing as to kind of, whether they are focused too much on the Conservative Party. I think they actually largely are ignoring the Conservative Party. Hard to when they're sitting opposite you and screaming at you. But no, I think they need to now start to care. And we did see that with the Zach comment, need to care a little bit more about the pressure they're getting from the left. And I think that is reflected a little bit in this budget, but it's a complicated thing to manage.
I mean, for all their obsession with polling, it's not doing them any favours in the actual polls. I mean, this is a sort of the irony of it, that had they been less concerned about the polling, they would probably be doing better now, because you might have actually sat down and thought about what is a narrative for this whole government.
Yeah.
And Keir Starmer's gone through goodness knows how many different resets and pillars and plans and projects and whatever it is, this week, and it's just round and round, and none of it has worked, because none of it adds up to like what is the story they can tell. By the way, that's not just a political thing that you have to sort of sell this politically and tell people what it is you're actually trying to do here. There's an economic part to this. A large part of why is it that bond markets are somewhat rattled by this government's behaviour is because there is no obvious plan here. Rachel Reeves saying we want growth. Okay, well, everybody wants growth. It doesn't tell you a thing, right? Yeah. And then lurching around trying to not hit the rules that you invented. This is not a story. This is not giving any sense that this is a government that knows in 5 years' time or 3 years' time now, this is what it will look like for the next election.
I think that's a really good point, that like it's not just the politics that needs a story, because also when you have economic uncertainty and constant flailing, then businesses don't want to commit. People don't want to spend because they're like, well, we don't know what's coming in the budget. We don't know if income tax is going to go up. So yeah, I completely agree, the lack of story. I guess on the reform point, it was less that, so they should have said something racist about asylum seekers, which tends to be the way that Labour tries to ingratiate itself with the people I think it's losing. But I think the common thread between the people who are saying, I'm going to vote Green or I'm going to vote Reform, is a sense of like, this system isn't working. And a big reason that the system isn't working for people is the economy. Yeah. So it just seems strange to me that we then have these kind of weird tinkering. You're right, child benefit is great. Things that relieve energy bills are good. Hadn't realised it was paid for by reducing companies' obligations. But that bigger sense of people just look at this country, the crumbling public services, how expensive everything is, and they're like, this isn't working. Like, what you're doing isn't working. And that, I think, didn't speak to it at all. And I think you're right. It's this weird, like, people-pleasing, obsession with focus groups. So there's not a clear story, and a clear story about the economy that was like, roll up our sleeves, like, this is fucked, but we can fix it. We're going to take some tough choices. It's going to take a few years. Rather than just the Yeah,
I think they've actually, more than that, they've told themselves an untruth about what happened. Yeah. They've told themselves that they got elected because of fiscal responsibility and because of this commitment to not increase these taxes, which they effectively now have. That's not why they got elected. They got elected because people didn't want the Conservatives in power anymore. And, so I always go back to the 28 billion moment, and we kind of forget about that now, but the moment at which they abandoned their kind of big green transition, Green New Deal plan, that was a moment at which they decided that their electoral strategy was to remove any reason people could have to not vote Labour. And the manifesto at that point just collapsed into something very skeletal. And now you're seeing that also meant the removal of a story and an economic strategy. And the consequence of that, then you're just bound by these rules without any strategy for the things you say you are trying to achieve. It's just not convincing. But you came in on that. And if I looking back, obviously the benefit of hindsight, but I would have gone for a smaller majority and a firmer manifesto.
It's not even clear it would have been a smaller majority. I think that's the saddest thing. And we'll have Rachel Reeves and probably still Morgan McSweeney in a few years being like, well, I kept my promise. And it's like, no one remembers the promise. No one remembers your fiscal rules. You're Labour. You should have come in, fixed the NHS, made life easier for people who aren't rich. And I think it's a fault. Maybe I think they got obsessed with their segments and their hero voters when a bunch of people were just really pissed off with the Tories and were just like, I don't want to see.
And that's the thing, if you are constantly polling people and in these like tiny microcosms, you're forgetting that actually if you zoom out, and I was reminded the other day, if you look longitudinally at like shifts in values over time, even with all the media advantage that the right has had, like values haven't really shifted. Immigration is a big area where they have. But aside from that, they haven't made much progress in denting the other kind of core values of a British voter. So why are you not leaning into some elements of that and building a story that credibly puts the cost of living first, but takes people on a journey, starts to confront these big challenges? I do not know. I
mean, the values thing is really the British Social Attitude Survey. I've been running for decades now. And it's so striking after decades of different versions, as you say, of like sort of neoliberal propaganda about the world. You've got to hate somebody who's on benefits. You've got to think government's always stupid. Corporations are always good. Rich people are always right. And it's just like really immovably, solidly, basically social democratic in your orientation, that redistribution's quite nice and we ought to look after people a bit. It's kind of where the average British person finds themselves in terms of those values. Do you have a party that particularly speaks to that right now? Well, I mean, you kind of notional gesticulations in that direction from Labour and maybe a bit more serious from the Greens. But it does leave this space open that is there to be exploited, and that one where people are incredibly angry about the state of the world, and rightly so. And I do feel like the sort of decisive, just doing the politics, I suppose, the decisive next group of voters are the people who are wondering between Green and Reform and probably not voting at all, right? That this is the actual volatile element out there that might end up in all sorts of different places over the next couple of years.
So do we think Keir and Rachel can survive this? Have they done
will
enough
they be
with
doing
this
the budget next year?
Is this their last budget, or has this bought them enough time to start to see some of the effects?
I mean, Rachel Reeves was doing the hard sell with the Parliamentary Labour Party well before this, but quite a defensive sell. It was like, I'm a fighter, not a quitter, sort of version of how to try and make this work. And I think there's enough in there for the Parliamentary Labour Party, the sort of soft left end of it, to say, this is good. I've seen momentum as well. Rightly, actually, the two-child benefit cap removal. So there's enough there to get them through this winter. The challenge will remain what's going to happen in May, and the fact that because you have not dealt with what I think is a bunch of deep underlying unhappinesses people have, particularly around the cost of living, I still think they're going to get an absolute hammering in the May elections.
I want to say two things about that. One, how bananas is it that 18 months, less than 18 months on from a huge Labour landslide, we're talking about whether the Prime Minister and Chancellor will have their jobs? This is not normal. It's not meritocratic. And I think James is right. It's much more about the mood of the PLP and whether they can stomach ousting a sitting Labour Prime Minister, which, let us not forget, is not in the DNA of the Labour Party. It is in the DNA of the Tories. Labour really struggles to knife someone in the back or the front. And I think the reality is the best time to bring a new Labour leader in is just before an election. So I think it's a bad time to get rid of Keir. I think he and team will have dug in. And I think that the Labour Party hasn't got the guts to get rid of them. So I think they probably will be here next year. And I think we'll probably be doing this special again. And I think it will be as disappointing.
Called it. I think, I'm not sure that he can survive it.
Yeah. You think the local elections will do for him?
Yeah, the local elections, how do you answer that if you have failed to deliver, if you've made huge losses in those areas?
There's got to be a challenger and they've got to have 80 MPs.
But also you can look at it the other way around, which is if you want to reset and you want to change the economic direction or anything else, this is also potentially your last chance to do that in a way that you can get in time and actually deliver something different for voters to give you a chance for the next election.
I'd agree with that. I think after May, we'll come and look at this again, but I don't see how Labour's done enough to turn those opinion polls around, enough that it'd be like Keir Starmer's home and dry and he's going to be entering the next election as Prime Minister.
To be clear, I don't think the polls will have turned round. I just have a lot of faith in the just like shitness of British politics and people just limping on.
No, and you're right to make that point. Labour does not like to do that to itself. So.
I haven't got the killer instinct. Thank you for listening to the first ever Over the Top, Under the Radar budget special. If you enjoyed it, please like and review wherever you get your podcasts. If you don't already listen to Macrodose and the New Economics podcast, check them out. They're both a great listen. This episode is brought to you with Power to Change to celebrate Community Business Week, which starts on the 29th of November.